Well, good evening, everybody. Apparently, it came to my attention that the video from last week sort of got corrupted. So apparently, we got a lot of the Lectio Divina, but we didn't get any of the discussion on holy orders. So I'm here tonight to actually re-record that portion to help us understand what's going on with holy orders. So if you missed last week, I'm sorry, and we're gonna kind of make it up here tonight. So. Um, when we talk about the sacrament of holy orders, recall last week our lecture was kind of about the installation or the ordination of the disciples of Jesus at the Last Supper to be made deacons by washing of the feet. Um, but it's also important to understand that that was not just the only aspect of holy orders. Also at the Last Supper, Jesus ordained those newly ordained deacons into priests when he says, "Do this in commemoration of me." And we see them made bishops actually at Pentecost. So maybe first we'll talk about the graces that are given in orders. And if you watch the video today from Holy Matrimony, the graces that are given are actually threefold, as they are for Holy Matrimony. But those graces are ones of service, sacrifice, and governance. So these also correspond to the three levels of orders: the diaconate, which is dedicated towards service; the presbyterate, which is directed towards sacrifice; and the episcopacy, or be a bishop, is directed towards governance. So we asked first off, all these are these biblical? Yes, of course. We heard about that in the Lectio that we had last week. We also see this in the Old Testament as well. The first priest that we hear about is actually named Melchizedek. He is a priest king. We hear this in the book of Genesis, that as Abraham is sent to the Holy Land, this land filled with milk and honey, he also has to battle some of the neighbors around him that are kind of hostile. And after one of such battle, he runs into this priest king and gives him 10% of everything that he got in this battle. You know, Melchizedek, he's a rather interesting figure is that we don't know of his origin. We don't know ever hear that he died. And so the tradition holds that's actually more of an eternal priesthood. He is the priest king of Salem, or the city of Salem, or Jerusalem, the city of peace. And it's a rather interesting figure. Because we hear these other forms of priesthood that develop in the Old Testament, namely with the establishment of the tabernacle. So Moses, he kind of consecrated his brother Aaron to be the first high priest when the tabernacle was established. We then hear about a new priesthood when Solomon builds the new temple, and this comes from the Aaronic order, but established sort of a new Davidic priesthood. What's interesting, though, is all these different priests coming from the Levite tribe that was always also in Genesis ordained to be the priestly tribe for the people of Israel. We then hear about the Babylonian exile, and so the temple is destroyed. And when they come back, there's only a small number that come back. And Nehemiah and some of the other prophets, we hear about this rebuilding of the temple, and from that comes a new priestly order. Again, from Levite tribe, but they're more what they call the Quranic and the Cordanic. We see that all the way through until the Greeks then come in and kind of profane the temple. Actually, last week we were hearing from the book of Maccabees in the liturgy, and the Maccabees has actually one of the stories is the rededication of the temple that we actually see the roots of Hanukkah that are celebrated today. So that's kind of what was going on up until the time of Jesus. But Jesus is of a different priesthood. We understand that Jesus' priesthood, because it also is eternal, is really more of a continuation of the priesthood of Melchizedek. And so it's a priesthood that never doesn't have a beginning and doesn't have an end because it's actually sourced in God himself. So we always look, of course, at these different aspects of the sacraments, namely the matter, the form, the recipient, the minister. So when we talk about the matter of the sacrament, it's actually rather unique in that the matter of the sacrament is actually human touch, that the minister actually touches the recipient, lays hands on them to actually confer the sacrament, right? The form is rather interesting because the form of each sacrament, there's actually different ordination prayers that are done for each of those levels. For instance, the diaconate ordination is actually about 5 paragraphs long. And a lot of it is sort of like looks at the roots of the diaconate, the service towards the temple, all these things. And there's like a paragraph in there that actually says, we pray for these holy men that they may help at the altar of the Lord. And so There's a big question, and even with the priesthood, there's sort of like the same aspect of the priest in the Old Testament, this kind of narrative, so to speak. But then there's actually like a paragraph where the minister kind of calls down the Holy Spirit upon the recipients to receive this grace to help in the governance, but also in the sacrifice of the Mass. It's interesting that the Episcopal ordination, right, is kind of held under lock and key. I couldn't actually get a copy of that because you have to be a bishop to get it, right? They want to make sure that don't people just don't ordain bishops willy nilly. But what's interesting about that ordination rite, the prayer of ordination, is that even if you were to mess up a word, in the same way, like if we look at the Eucharist, where it says that is my body instead of this is my body, or this is his body, that would not make it a valid sacrament. The Eucharist would not actually come about if those words are not done properly. It's not necessarily sure where the essential form is in that ordination prayer. And so it's very critical that if a word is missed, it goes back and said, because the church takes it very seriously and wants to make sure that the sacrament is given properly. And so you can imagine that it's kind of painstaking even for the minister of the sacrament to actually say every single word within those 5 or 6 paragraphs. So again, there's not necessarily an essential rite that's involved with that. Some actually are more explicit than others in the rite to kind of show what's actually happening. There's kind of an open discussion about that in the church about what actually is essential, what's not, what can be said, what can't. Right now, though, which you'll see if you go to an ordination rite, you'll notice that all the words are said. And if they are missed, they go back and do it again. One thing I had the experience of via Masters of Ceremonies when I was in the seminary, which meant I made sure that all the masses were done well, efficiently and well ordered. And sometimes it meant when I had to go MC for a particular bishop, especially an ordination rite, I was always very particular to make sure that the minister of the sacrament was saying the words, each word. And if they were miss one, we'd go back and do it again because it's that important. The recipient, actually, we talk about the minister first. So the minister of the sacrament is always going to be a bishop. It has to be a bishop. A bishop has the fullness of orders. They can actually minister any sacrament or witness any sacrament, I should say. Because as we heard in matrimony today, the reason that a priest or deacon or bishop is there is to witness the marriage, where the ministers actually are the bride and groom. In this regard, though, the bishop has that fullness, right? Not only to witness marriages, the same as a deacon or priest, but also confer the sacrament of holy orders. So, because of that headship they share as a successor of the apostles. And that's important because every priest, every deacon, every bishop can actually trace their lineage back to one of the 12 apostles from that Last Supper ordination. Recipients. So this is a rather controversial topic in some circles because to be a valid recipient of the sacrament of holy orders, one is to be a baptized male. Now, the reason that's so controversial is because of specifically because of the male priesthood. And the reasons for that actually are fourfold. So the first is a historical reason. And we talked about in the Old Testament, we go back to this lineage of our Hebrew roots that we find in Christianity and the Catholic Church. We find our roots in Judaism, the Hebrew people. And the Hebrew practice was always that a man was always a priest. We mentioned the Levite tribe. There were women in the Levite tribe, and they had ministries. They certainly did, but they never were priests. They didn't offer the sacrifice in the Holy of Holies. And there's reasons for that because at the time of the Hebrew people, there were other Gentile people, pagans, that did have female priests, but even they would not offer sacrifice in the same way. Some would say that what they did was rather sacrificial in many ways, but the actual aspect of a priestess, even in the pagan world and the Gentile world, was not one that offers animal sacrifice, one that sheds blood, but one that actually was a temple prostitute. And so it seems that God ordained that that was not dignified for the Hebrew women, or women in general, we would even say. And so that's the reason why there was a male priesthood. So in that regard, you could say, well, yeah, okay, that's all fine and good back in the past, but Jesus, right? He wasn't always big about those social norms. So why wouldn't Jesus establish a female priesthood? And that's a great question. Well, we have to first look at too this other aspect of custom. So we have historical, now we have custom. So we have to ask ourselves, who was actually present at the Last Supper when Jesus ordained these men? Well, it was just men. The 12 apostles were the only one at the Last Supper. Now we may ask ourselves, well, why? Well, the Passover celebration, it was always customary for the men and the women to separate. We see this actually in synagogue worship, that there was a men's side and a women's side, and even the temple, there was a court of women and a court of men. So every time there was ever worship in the Hebrew system, there was always a separation of the sexes. And even during the Passover celebration, the men would go with the men and eat the meals and do the rites. The women go with the women and celebrate the rites and eat their own meals. And so we may recall that Jesus being lost in the temple for about 5 days. And when we ask ourselves, well, why that happened? Well, Jesus was 12 years old, which meant he wasn't yet a man. And because he wasn't yet at the age of manhood, he could have gone with the women for Passover or with the men for Passover. So when the sexes separate, of course, it's very easy to assume that if I were Joseph, well, he must be with Mary. And if I were Mary, oh, he must be with Joseph. He's that age. And when they come finally realize that he's gone, they come together after celebrating the Passover for about 7 days and realize, wait a minute, he's not here. I thought you had him. I thought you had him. And of course, they travel back to Jerusalem and look for him for 3 days. And they find him, of course, in the temple, teaching the Pharisees, teaching the rabbis about his father, about the faith, and it was very profound. So Jesus would have kept that custom even at the time of the Last Supper, because that's just what you did at the Passover celebration. Now you may say, well, yeah, but that's Jesus was really kind of not necessarily upholding a lot of the man-made traditions. Well, why would he uphold this one? And that's really a great question. We're not really sure, but it may have something to do more what we call the ontological understanding. So when we talk about the Eucharist, there's always a connection, of course, with these sacraments of service and the Eucharist itself, and more intimately when it comes to the sacrament of Holy Orders. We can't have the Eucharist without Holy Orders. We can't have Holy Orders without the Eucharist. And it makes sense that when Jesus gives his disciples and us his body, blood, and soul, Jesus could have come as a woman, but he came as a man. Now you could say, well, if he came as a woman, he probably would have gone through that sacrifice he had to go through. He probably wouldn't have actually been crucified in the way he did. That's all true. And so there's maybe a reason why he was a man rather than a woman, but he still could have come as a woman and did what he did because he was God. Or, even as a female, as a woman, she could have done what she did because she's God. But he came as a man. And then when he gives us himself in the Last Supper, that's a male body. That's male blood. We would even say that's a male soul, as even male and femaleness are kind of a function of the soul. They're kind of both a function of the body and the soul. And so we understand there's importance in that it seems very clear that if Jesus is a man giving himself as a male way, that the minister of the sacrament, who's standing in the person of Jesus, also be male. And so we call that an ontological, which means like the essence, the very being, kind of understanding the reason. Because again, he could have been incarnate as a woman, but he wasn't. And if he were, maybe that's a different discussion. But it also makes sense that then there'd be a male priesthood from that. Finally, we could also look at this as kind of what we call the sacramental reason. So every time we go to Mass, we actually witness a marriage. We have a bride, who is the church, and we have a bridegroom, who is the priest, as standing in the place of Jesus. And so this aspect of marriage is actually present also in the sacrament of Holy Orders. As we mentioned today, these kind of similarities between these two sacraments of service, that I, as a priest, I'm married. I'm married to the church, right? I take the church as my bride, as Jesus does, because I'm standing in the person of Jesus, especially in these sacramental aspects. And so every time we go to Mass, we're witnessing this marriage, right? And so for that reason, it does make sense that it would be a male priesthood rather than a female. Part of this also is an understanding of Catholic anthropology. So what does it mean to be a man and woman in God's plan, right? That in that regard, like no matter how much I desire or want or maybe feel is unfair, that I as a man cannot actually give birth to a child, we understand in a biological way that's part of God's plan. And so we would even say in this regard that if Jesus didn't actually ordain women, because there were actually probably worthy women that could have been ordained. For instance, Mary Magdalene, the Blessed Mother, but they weren't. And this even is even fulfilled in tradition and even found in the scripture that after the resurrection, we see the first thing that the apostles do is ordain a new bishop. And they do that between two men, Barnabas, as well as Matthias, right? And then they ordain Matthias to be this new bishop. So it's evident that that's actually kind of part of God's plan. And we could say, well, we as a church then cannot change it if Jesus himself didn't. So it's not an aspect of um, should, it's more an issue of can. And so if Jesus didn't, it seems that also the church has no authority to do anything different than that. So that's kind of a very important understanding of that. So from that, we kind of see this kind of hierarchy, and we'll call this the hierarchy of service. So what the way that this hierarchy works is that the one that served the most is at the top, and that's followed by those that serve the ones above, right? So in other words, it's not necessarily like there's a hierarchy of kind of authority. It's more of a hierarchy of service. And so the ones that are most served are lay people, right? Those that are baptized, those who are made in God's image and likeness, they are served the most by the church. And so in that regard, they're at the top, they're at the highest of that hierarchy. Below them, the ones that serve them most directly are called sisters and brothers. And they're part of what we call consecrated life. The ones that serve them are also part of consecrated life. They're called monks and nuns. And we may ask, well, what's the difference? We kind of use those terms interchangeably, but there is a difference. So a sister or a brother, they typically have some kind of practical work, practical ministry in the world. Maybe that's teaching. Maybe that's working in a hospital. Maybe that's parish ministry. Maybe that's as a doctor or nurse, whatever it is. Maybe it's even feeding the poor or whatever it may be. Those are practical ways of working in the church, and those would be properly called sisters and brothers. Nuns and monks have a role where they're kind of more directed towards prayer. So oftentimes you might see these forms of consecrated life, what they call cloisters, meaning they're kind of separated from the world. Some even take extreme as they take like vows of silence and asceticism, meaning they live a very, very simple life. Typically, those in whether it be in a sister or brother or a monk or nun, take what they call the evangelical counsels as vows, meaning poverty, obedience, and chastity, right? And so, in that regard, they are a consecrated life. They're not holy orders, but they live a life of great devotion to our God and as a great service to the church, right? And are very profound in that way. Then after that, we get in the level of holy orders. So the ones that serve monks and nuns directly, and then more profoundly everyone else, would be deacons. And there are two forms of diaconate. There are permanent deacons like our Deacon Dave, who's our deacon here at St. Anne, and there are transitional deacons. So you have to be ordained a deacon first before ordained a priest, and of course you have to be ordained a priest first before you're a bishop. So everyone that's ordained is a deacon. And the permanent deacons usually stay deacons for the rest of their life. Although that they don't necessarily have to. We've had in the archdiocese several men who, for whatever reason, whether their wives pass away, or there's maybe annulment, whatever, they then become priests. Transitional deacons are kind of more temporary in that ministry until they are actually ordained priests. So, for instance, I was ordained a deacon, and then a little over a year later, I was ordained a priest with my other ordinands. And so those are kind of the two forms of the diaconate. Typically, there's a lot of permanent deacons that are married. Transitional deacons typically are not. Especially in the Western Church, we kind of practice that, and we'll talk about that in kind of a second. Below them, deacons would be priests. So priests, and there's also times honorary titles that are given within these different orders, right? For instance, in the priestly life, there also could be someone that would be named a monsignor. And there are three types of monsignors. I don't really remember all of their different names. Actually, I can look them up if you want to. But monsignors are just, it's an honorary title given by Rome that usually recognizes some kind of aspect of their ministry. Maybe it's like, maybe actually years of service or a particular role they have. Like, for instance, there are particular assignments that come with it, the title of what they call very reverend, and that's would be like what the monsignor would be. So the three levels of the monsignors would be a protonary apostolic. You don't really have too many of those left around anymore. We don't really have monsignors in general. Pope Francis, soon after he was elevated to the papacy, um, he kind of made it a decree that monsignors to become a monsignor, it kind of made it a little more difficult. And the reason I think he did that was because he kind of thought that if you're in the realm of a monsignor, you should also be eligible to become a bishop. And we needed more bishops than we need monsignors. That was his opinion. Sure, why not? There's honorary prelate to His Holiness. So this is probably the most common, or this is kind of more the least common. These were rare. Then chaplain to His Holiness are probably the most common. But again, they're not really making monsignors too much anymore, partially because of the age restriction. You have to be at least 65 years of age to be even determined to be monsignor now. Before that was about 35 years of age. So there's been some changes there, development. Maybe we're going to go back. Sure, who knows? We'll see what happens. After Monsignor, then we get in the realm of the episcopacy. This is kind of the third level of holy orders, and these are bishops. And within the bishopcy, the episcopacy, there typically are honorary titles given within that. Like, for instance, archbishop. So what would be the difference between archbishop and a bishop? Well, the answer to that is really nothing, except that an archbishop is in charge of an archdiocese, a bishop is in charge of a diocese. Well, what makes an archdiocese different than a diocese? Archdiocese different than a diocese? Well, typically that has to do with like population size or historical importance. So here in St. Louis, we have an archdiocese. We were one of the, I think we're the third archdiocese that was established here in the United States. And part of it's because of how prevalent we were for the development of the other dioceses in the United States. We were actually originally part of New Orleans, and then we were part of Quebec. And we eventually got our own diocese, which basically stemmed from basically entire Louisiana Purchase. So north of Louisiana, Arkansas, and then all the way west up the Missouri River, basically all the way to the Pacific Ocean almost. And so because of that significance that every diocese kind of west of us was originally part of St. Louis Archdiocese, we're always going to be an archdiocese just because of the nature of who we are. Most states or regions have an archdiocese because they're typically what they call the metropolitan, but that's more of a legal thing, so we won't really get into that. Then also within the episcopacy, there's also an honorary title given of cardinal. Now, a cardinal is, there are kind of three ranks of cardinals. There's cardinal deacons, cardinal priests, cardinal bishops, and that really is basically associated with a particular church that you're put in charge of in Rome because you're part of the clergy of Rome. And with that title often comes responsibility to vote for the new pope if and when the occasion arises. So there's also a limitation of that too, that you must be below the age of 80 at the time of the calling of the cardinals. And so like we had a papal election just 6 months ago, actually. It was kind of crazy how long ago that seems, but also how short it was. An American cardinal from the United States, but he was a bishop in Peru, was elevated to the papacy by his fellow cardinals who were all under the age of 80. And so the cardinal usually is that. The word cardinal actually is a Latin term, means hinge. And so what does a hinge do? A hinge supports. And that's the main job of a cardinal, to support the pope. And then, of course, at the very bottom of this hierarchy is the servants of the service of God, who is known as the Pope. The Pope is an archbishop. He's the Archbishop of Rome. And with that particular office comes a mission and an authority to what they call maintain dogma. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the papacy in a few weeks. But that's really, again, it's an honorary title that's given to a particular man who is called to actually lead the church in her faith and morals, become the representative of Christ on earth. So that's the hierarchy. Let's talk a little bit about celibacy. So it is a discipline, but it's not essential. So a married man can be ordained. We see that with our permanent deacons. In the Eastern Church, a lot of priests are married. We even see in the Roman Rite, which is the rite that we have here at St. Anne, some men are married and they are priests. Now, why does that happen? Well, typically it happens in the Western Church and what we call the Roman Church, right? So where there's many different churches within the Catholic Church. There are Eastern, there's like Byzantine, there are Ruthenians, there are Ambrosian, there are Chaldeans. All of these are actually part of the Catholic Church, but they have their own customs, traditions within their own jurisdiction. So typically in the East, most of the Eastern churches, priests tend to get married before they get ordained. Now, you must be married before you're ordained. You can't get ordained and then become married. No matter whether it's West in the East, that's always the case. So when we have people in the West, in the Roman Rite, who are ordained, typically they're married before they get ordained, and this typically happens when, let's say, a man is an Anglican or a Lutheran, and they are in charge of a congregation. They make their living off of what they do as a minister and provide for their families through what they do as a minister. But let's say they want to convert, they want to become Catholic. Well, it would be unjust to tell the person because now that you're Catholic, I'm sorry, you can't provide for your family in the way you used to, right? So most men who are converts from these other denominations, they're given the option, and if they so desire, they would become priests, and then through that their priesthood they would actually provide for their families. But in the West, we tend to understand that there's a great discipline in this of actually maintaining celibacy. And the reason for this is actually so that the priest can actually be available for the people they serve. So again, if I'm married to the church, um, let's say if I did have a family and I had to choose between my family and my ministry, well, boy, that'd be a very hard thing to do. Now, the church is very clear that for those of us, those priests and deacons who have families, their family comes first. They're first. Now, if we had that didn't necessarily have that celibacy in the rest of the church, and let's say men could get married and whatever else, well, that causes a lot of problems because, again, there could be opportunities where, okay, let's say if my family's sick and someone called me to go visit them in the hospital, well, I have to choose my family, and that person in the hospital has to suffer. Won't be able to get the sacraments, won't be able to have their sins forgiven, and that could be detrimental for their soul. So the celibacy is not just an act of conforming to Jesus Christ every day, because that's one of the promises that a priest makes is that they conform their lives every day closer to Jesus, and we fail at that every day because we're not perfect. But that we promise to try to do that every day, and one of the ways we try to do that is maintain the same celibacy as Jesus did. So Jesus was not married, and therefore the person that's standing in his place should not be married either if he's trying to conform closer and closer to Jesus. But more practical. So, for instance, we do have some priests here in St. Louis who are married, and actually, I got the opportunity to accompany one before he got ordained on a summer camp for this youth group. And we were driving down there, and we were the only ones up because all the kids were sleeping in the car. We were just kind of turned. I turned to him and I said, what do you think about the priestly celibacy? Because he actually came from an Anglican tradition. He actually was married, had 5 kids, had a sixth one on the way. And one thing he said something very profound. He said it was the wisest thing that the Catholic Church ever did. Because he said when he was an Anglican, especially an Anglican minister, he always had to choose between his family and his ministry. No matter what he chose, one of them suffered. And so, not just from a spiritual aspect of conforming to Christ, but from a practical aspect, to not necessarily have to make that choice. It's easier that if someone calls me on the phone and says, "I'm sick, Father, can you come visit?" Yes, yeah. There's no hesitation, of course, right? So it makes a lot of sense when we talk about celibacy, but it's important to understand too. It's not essential, but it is a good practice, a good discipline. Um, we already talked about the holy men. A little bit of apostolic succession. So I think that's actually something that every one of us can actually trace our ordinations back to one of the apostles. And that's really what apostolic succession is all about. And one would argue, well, wait a minute, don't like Lutherans or Anglicans, these other denominations have that because they were all founded by Catholic clergy. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. He was a priest. And when he broke away, more maybe from political issues and theological issues, although his theology changed over time. Zwingli, he was a deacon. Calvin was a Catholic deacon. So we see these clergymen, Catholic clergymen, that kind of go their own way and maybe cause these divisions. Well, even though they themselves were maybe ordained and even maybe brought some bishops with them, once they severed themselves from the head, meaning the Pope, they lost that chain of succession. And so even if they attempted to ordain people, we would understand that because of that severance, because of that schism, they separated themselves from the church. And because of that separation, they lost that apostolic succession. Now, many would probably argue that they still have it. I think that's kind of an open discussion, but I think it makes sense that if you were to, if the body were to separate itself from the head, the body would be would be in compromised at least. And so in that regard, you kind of lose that connection that you once had. And so that's kind of what apostolic succession is a great attribute to the church, because we can trace our lineage not only back to the apostles, but also there's a continuous succession of teaching that's been handed down from generation to generation through the grace of orders, that the office of the deacon, priest, and bishop are called to promote. So that's kind of holy orders in a nutshell. If there are any questions, you can kind of leave them in the comments of the video, and I'll try to answer them best of my ability. And sorry about the video last week, but I think we got it all here this time. So please feel free to watch this, and we'll see you next. Actually, we'll see you next week because we're off for Thanksgiving. We'll see you the week after. We're going to talk about the church. So God bless you, and thanks for your attention. Bye bye.